Time is the critical variable for reducing Iran's economic risk. The scenario surrounding the conflict in the Gulf has several critical points. The first concerns its potential expansion. China and Russia show no willingness to engage in the defense of the Iranian regime. Beijing has assessed that a belligerent stance would not be in its interest. This calculation is rational, considering that China, despite accelerating its military buildup, is not yet ready to challenge the United States militarily. Moreover, in its long-term strategy, the goals of achieving global primacy, necessary to push America into a secondary role, require much longer timelines. Russia faces capacity constraints and is likely engaged in a discreet, ongoing dialogue with Washington to resolve the Ukrainian issue. Therefore, fears of a global escalation of this conflict are not supported by current evidence. Second, Iran's strategy. The theocratic regime had long prepared for conflict and for the possible elimination of its top leadership, appointing at least 4 alternatives for every senior position and organizing its militias into roughly 30 districts to maximize internal control. This strategy relies on the assumption that the United States will not launch a ground offensive, allowing the regime to survive even if deprived of its external offensive capabilities. Consequently, the goal of regime change, or even significant conditioning of the regime, is unlikely to be achievable in the short term. This defines the third critical point, both economic and financial: the duration of the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. 2 or 3 weeks of interruption are manageable, because if the strait were reopened, markets would rebound and inflationary pressures would ease. But if the disruption of energy flows were to continue, these risks would increase, with a clear potential for market destabilization. The way to mitigate this risk would be to accelerate actions aimed at dismantling the regime's self-preservation capabilities, thereby triggering internal divisions that could allow a new command structure to emerge, a fracture already visible, for example, in the divergences between Iran's presidential institution and the militias. Likelihood of regime change is increasing, driven by a broad popular consensus against the theocratic leadership, possibly supported in part by the institutional armed forces, which have long been constrained by the dominance of the regime's militias. However, this scenario raises the risk of a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz lasting longer than a few weeks, with economic repercussions on the oil cycle and related sectors, increasing inflation. Part of this effect can be contained in the United States and Europe through anti-speculative stabilizing measures, diversification of supply sources, and similar tools. But if the military operation in the Gulf were to last 2 or 3 months, there would still be a recessionary impact, a non-expansionary monetary policy, and financial uncertainty, moderate rather than catastrophic, but significant nonetheless. If the timeline were to extend further, the associated economic and financial impact would worsen. On the geopolitical level, however, the conflict area remains regional or local, not global. But on the other hand, the negative economic and financial consequences would become global if the timeline for resolving this localized conflict were to stretch out.